So our upcoming October auction, which is going to take place in Cape Town, has an exceptional collection of Oriental ceramics on display. I'd like to concentrate more particularly on the Japanese and Chinese blue and white porcelain. And I would like to highlight the historical context in which each piece was created. The very first European power that arrived in China were the Portuguese, that arrived at the beginning of the 16th century. They were shortly followed by the Spanish, but I'd like to concentrate more particularly on the arrival of the Dutch. So the Dutch, in competition with the Portuguese and Spanish, decided to go to Asia themselves. They sailed over, and in 1602 they started the VOC. The Dutch East India Company was founded, and shortly after that they established bases both in Japan and in China. They also started to capture large Portuguese carracks, ships, and from the cargo, we find sometimes up to 100,000 blue and white Chinese porcelain pieces. The Dutch noticed that these blue and white pieces were extremely sought after in Europe. They were selling from auction houses all over Amsterdam, and there was a huge demand for them. In fact, Chinese porcelain was so sought after in Europe in the early 1600s that it was valued as highly as gold and some of the precious jewels. Here we have a beautiful example of a Kruck porcelain piece, and it's a term that was actually used much later on. Sometime during the 1670s we see its use, and this was to distinguish against another blue and white Chinese export ware that was starting to be developed at the time. Kruck ware was produced really in mass quantities from the middle of the 16th century, and we see its characteristic of being very thinly potted. The body is always very thinly potted, and they're referred to as having almost a metallic quality. One of the defining characteristics of this ware is that the motifs that decorate it are enclosed within geometric borders. So we see alternating panels. For example, on this dish that we're looking at, we see alternating panels of flower heads and Buddhist emblems. The central scene to the base of the dish is enclosed again within a border. We see a scene of birds, aquatic birds, which becomes very representative of this ware. So from the late 16th century, we start to see a certain political instability and internal conflict in China. And this has a direct impact on the imperial kilns of Chongzhen. So what we find is that a lot of the very skilled potters and craftsmen go elsewhere looking for work. And they find the Dutch in the early 17th century, and what then starts to happen is a mass production of Chinese blue and white Kruckware that is going directly from the potters and the kilns and being exported by the Dutch to Europe. From about 1620, 1630, we start to see the arrival, the appearance of another type of blue and white ceramic, which is known as transitional ware. So transitional ware would exist at the same time as Kruckware for a large number of decades. And the impact of what was happening at the imperial kilns. So from the 1620s, 1630s, China was really going into a type of civil war. And the imperial court was withdrawing all of its resources that had previously been spending on the porcelain industry. So what happened is that the imperial courts of Chongzhen fell into private hands. Now, for the first time, there was a sort of freeness, an imagination that was given to the potters where they were allowed to experiment, and they started experimenting with different forms. The shapes of the vessels start to change. We start to see a much broader surface given to these vessels so that they have more work to paint, a type of porcelain canvas, if you'd like. So another interesting example I'd like to look at, known as Swatow, the Swatow dish, which today is more commonly referred to as Zhangzhou. Swatow ware is very interesting because it was exported by the Dutch, but it was never really sent to Europe. It was exported by the Dutch for the Indian market, the Middle Eastern market, the Japanese market, the Southeast Asian market. So it was appreciated by the local Asian market. We find large quantities of Swatow examples even in the Cape, because the VOC was sending this utilitarian ware to all the different posts of its company. I just want to quickly highlight the link between the Chinese and the Japanese blue and white porcelain industries, which are actually directly linked, because what happens is in 1644, it's the end of the Ming Dynasty and China breaks into civil war. So the production of blue and white porcelain starts to dwindle. And the Dutch, who'd already established a trading post in Japan from the early 1600s, realized that they no longer are going to have a supply of Chinese blue and white porcelain. So naturally in the 1950s, the Dutch turned to Japan as the only real reliable source for more blue and white porcelain. Remember that the Dutch had been importing Swatow'Zhangzhou from about 1614 into Japan, which was very highly sought after and praised in Japan. And the Japanese start to copy this blue and white Chinese ware. It's interesting to bear in mind that the Japanese had not been practicing the art of porcelain for nearly as long as the Chinese. Already by the 1650s, this was a relatively new art. We know that about 1621, the Japanese were making their own porcelain, but it was really a relatively new art in Japan. What's also interesting is that they don't simply copy Chinese blue and white porcelain. They adopt different stylistic elements and different shapes and different means of potting from the various blue and white wares, the Chinese wares that I've discussed previously. For example, they had a high appreciation for a very loosely painted, quite spontaneous decoration that we find in the Swatow'Zhangzhou, so they borrowed that. From the Transitional ware, they loved the sturdiness of the pieces. There's usually a very flat, unglazed foot rim, which is also adopted from the Transitional pieces. We're very lucky on the sale to have a series of pieces that link together so beautifully in a historical context, that show the various relationships that existed between China and Japan and the Dutch.